Good evening, and welcome to Hista Hispa. Tonight, we journey back to the very beginning of civilization itself, to a land between two rivers, where humanity first learned to write, to build cities, to organize societies. Close your eyes and let your mind drift back more than 5,000 years, to ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Imagine standing on a dusty plain under an endless sky. The sun is setting, casting golden light across a vast landscape. To your left, the Tigris River flows steadily, its waters life-giving, essential. To your right, the Euphrates, winding through the land, carrying fertile soil from distant mountains. This is Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning the land between rivers. Today, we call this region Iraq, but thousands of years ago this was where everything began. The first farmers, abandoning their nomadic ways, settled here around 10,000 BCE. They discovered something remarkable. When the rivers flooded each year, they left behind rich, dark soil, perfect for growing crops. At first, these were small villages, clusters of mud brick homes, surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. Families working together, planting seeds in spring, harvesting in autumn. Children playing near the riverbank while their parents worked the land. But the rivers could be unpredictable. Sometimes the floods came too early, or too late, destroying crops. So the people learned to dig canals, to control the water, to bring it where they needed it. This was the beginning of irrigation, one of humanity's greatest innovations. And as the farms became more productive, the villages grew into towns, and the towns into cities. By 3500 BCE, the world's first true civilization was emerging: the Sumerians. Picture the landscape changing over centuries. Where once there were scattered huts, now stand mud brick buildings, rising 2 and 3 stories high. The canals crisscross the fields like veins, bringing water to every corner of the farmland. In the distance, you can see the outline of a city. Walls of mud brick, thick and tall, protecting the people inside. And beyond those walls, something extraordinary. A massive structure rising in steps toward the sky. A ziggurat. Let us walk closer to this city. As we approach, the sounds of life grow louder. Voices calling out, the bleating of sheep, the creaking of wooden cart wheels on dusty roads. The smell of bread baking, of animals, of river water carried in clay jars. This is Uruk, one of the greatest cities of ancient Sumer. And it is about to change the world. We enter through the city gates. Guards stand watch, spears in hand, but they nod as we pass. The streets are narrow, winding between flat-roofed houses made of sun-dried mud bricks. Each house is built around a central courtyard, open to the sky. These courtyards are the heart of family life. Women grind grain into flour using heavy stone tools. Children chase each other, laughing, their bare feet slapping against the hard-packed earth. Men sit in the shade, repairing tools, discussing the day's work. The air is hot, dry, filled with dust, but also filled with life. A potter sits at his wheel, his hands moving with practiced ease, shaping wet clay into vessels. These vessels will hold grain, water, oil. They are essential to daily life. Nearby, a weaver works at her loom. Threads of wool pass through her fingers, slowly creating fabric. This fabric will become clothing, blankets, trade goods. The smell of fresh bread drifts from a nearby oven. A woman pulls out flat rounds of bread, golden and steaming. Bread is the staff of life here. Made from barley, eaten with every meal. We continue walking through the streets. Ahead we see the market district. Here, the streets widen slightly. Merchants have set up stalls, displaying their wares. Baskets of dates, dark and sweet. Strings of dried fish from the river. Clay pots of all sizes. Tools made of copper gleaming in the sunlight. People haggle, argue over prices, laugh at jokes. This is commerce, trade, the lifeblood of the city. But towering above everything, dominating the skyline, is the ziggurat. Let us make our way there. The ziggurat is a massive stepped pyramid, built of millions of mud bricks. Each brick was made by hand, dried in the sun, and carried into place by countless workers over many years. The structure rises in 3 great terraces, each smaller than the one below. At the very top, a temple, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war. We begin to climb the long stairway that leads to the summit. The steps are worn smooth by thousands of feet over hundreds of years. As we climb, the city spreads out below us. We can see the entire layout now. The houses packed close together. The canals bringing water into the city. The fields beyond the walls, green with growing crops, and in the distance, the rivers, glinting silver in the afternoon sun. At the top of the ziggurat, priests move about, performing their sacred duties. They wear long robes, their heads shaved. They tend to the statue of Inanna, making offerings of bread, beer, and meat. The people believe that the gods live here, in these high places, closer to heaven, and the priests are the intermediaries, the ones who can speak to the gods on behalf of humanity. From up here, you can see why the ziggurat is so important. It is a mountain in a flat land. A connection between earth and sky. Between the mortal and the divine. Let us descend now, and explore more of the city. In one corner of Uruk, there is a special building, the scribble school. Here, young boys, usually from wealthy families, come to learn something revolutionary. Writing, we enter quietly. The room is dim, lit only by small windows near the ceiling. Boys sit cross-legged on the floor, clay tablets before them. In their hands, they hold red styluses, sharpened to a point. The teacher walks among them, stern, watchful. He corrects a boy's work with a sharp word. The boy smooths the wet clay and tries again. This is cuneiform, the writing system of the Sumerians. The word means wedge-shaped, because each character is made up of wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay. Learning to write is difficult. There are hundreds of signs to memorize. Some represent objects, like a barley stalk or a jar. Others represent sounds or ideas. A student must practice for years before he can read and write fluently. But once trained, a scribe has access to knowledge and power. He can record grain deliveries, tax payments, legal contracts. He can write letters for merchants, copy religious texts, keep temple accounts. Scribes are essential to the functioning of this complex society. Watch as one young boy carefully presses his stylus into the clay. He is writing a simple practice text, one that scribes have been copying for generations. Again and again the same signs. His hand cramps, but he continues. The teacher watches, nods slightly. Good. When the tablet is finished, it will be set in the sun to dry, or baked in an oven to make it permanent. These clay tablets are the memory of Sumerian civilization. Thousands of them have been found by archaeologists, telling us about business deals, legal disputes, religious beliefs, and even love poems. As evening approaches, the city begins to slow down. The heat of the day is fading. People return to their homes. Lamps are lit, small clay bowls filled with oil and a wick. They cast a warm, flickering light. Let us visit a typical home. We enter through a narrow doorway into a central courtyard. The courtyard is cool, catching the evening breeze. The family is gathering here. The father, a merchant who trades in wool and textiles, has returned from his day at the market. The mother supervises the evening meal. Barley bread still warm. A thick stew made with lentils and onions. Dates for sweetness. And beer, the drink of choice in Sumer, made from fermented barley. The children, tired from play, settle onto woven mats. As the family eats, the father tells a story. One his father told him, and his grandfather before that. It is the story of Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who was strong beyond measure and wise beyond his years, but who was also proud and restless. The children listen, their eyes wide. They know this story, have heard it many times, but they never tire of it. Gilgamesh, their father tells them, went on a great journey. He fought the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest. He traveled to the ends of the earth, searching for the secret of immortality. He met Utnapishtim, the man who survived the great flood. And in the end, Gilgamesh learned that immortality is not for mortals, but that a man can live on through his deeds, through the cities he builds, through the stories told about him. The children drift off to sleep as the story winds down. Their parents carry them to their sleeping mats in the cool rooms off the courtyard. The lamps are extinguished, one by one, and Uruk sleeps under a sky filled with stars. Over the centuries, the Sumerians developed many innovations that would shape human civilization. Let us explore some of these remarkable achievements. First, the wheel. Around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians invented the potter's wheel, which allowed for the mass production of clay vessels. Soon after, they adapted this technology to create wheeled vehicles. Imagine a farmer struggling to transport his harvest on a sled dragged by oxen. The sled catches on rocks, gets stuck in the mud. It is slow, exhausting work. Then someone has an idea. What if, instead of dragging the load, we placed it on a platform with round discs underneath? The first wheels were solid wood, cut from tree trunks. Heavy, but revolutionary. Suddenly, transporting goods became much easier. Trade increased. Cities could grow larger as food and materials could be brought in from greater distances. Another invention was the plow. Before the plow, farmers used simple digging sticks to break up the soil. It was backbreaking labor. But the Sumerians developed a wooden plow, pulled by oxen. This allowed them to cultivate much larger fields, producing more food. And more food meant more people could live in the cities, specializing in crafts, trade, religion, and government. The Sumerians also developed a sophisticated number system. They used a base 60 system, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Their mathematicians could calculate areas, volumes, and solve complex problems. This mathematical knowledge was essential for building projects, for dividing land, for keeping accurate records. In the realm of astronomy, the Sumerians were meticulous observers. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. They created a lunar calendar, dividing the year into 12 months. They knew when to plant and when to harvest based on the positions of the stars. Priests would climb to the top of the ziggurats at night, watching the sky, recording what they saw on clay tablets. They believed that the movements of the heavenly bodies were messages from the gods. And to some extent, they were right. The stars guided the seasons, the floods, the cycle of life. The Sumerians also had a complex legal system. Contracts were written and sealed. Disputes were settled in courts. There were laws governing property, marriage, inheritance, and crime. Imagine a dispute over a field. Two farmers claim ownership. They go before a judge, bringing witnesses and written documents. The judge examines the evidence, questions the witnesses, and makes a ruling. The decision is recorded on a clay tablet, signed with cylinder seals, and stored in the temple archive. This is the rule of law, one of the foundations of civilized society. In terms of architecture, the Sumerians built not just ziggurats, but also palaces, temples, and elaborate homes for the wealthy. They used arches and vaults, techniques that would later be perfected by the Romans. Their buildings were decorated with mosaics made of colored stones and shells, creating beautiful geometric patterns. The Sumerians also loved music. They played lyres, harps, drums, and flutes. Music was part of religious ceremonies, festivals, and daily life. In the evenings, people would gather to sing songs, tell stories, and celebrate. One of the most remarkable aspects of Sumerian culture was their literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest known works of literature. It tells the story of Gilgamesh's quest for meaning and immortality. But the Sumerians also wrote hymns, prayers, proverbs, and even love songs. One tablet reads, "Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honeysweet." These words, written over 4,000 years ago, remind us that the Sumerians were people just like us. They loved, they mourned, they hoped, they dreamed. As the centuries passed, Sumerian cities continued to flourish. Eridu, Lagash, Nippur each was a center of culture and commerce. But prosperity also brought conflict. The cities competed for resources, for water rights, for control of trade routes. Wars were fought, walls were built higher, armies were raised. And in the midst of this competition, a new power was rising to the north. The Akkadians, around 2300 BCE, a man named Sargon rose to power. Sargon was not born into royalty. According to legend, he was found as a baby in a basket floating on the river, much like Moses in the biblical story. He was raised by a gardener and eventually became a cupbearer to the king of Kish. But Sargon was ambitious, clever, and ruthless. He seized power, overthrew his master, and set out to conquer the Sumerian cities. One by one, the great cities fell to Sargon's armies. Uruk, Lagash all were brought under Akkadian control. Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location is still unknown. He declared himself king of Sumer and Akkad, the first true emperor in history. The Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It was a vast realm, united under one ruler, one language, one administration. Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, but the Akkadians did not destroy Sumerian culture. Instead, they absorbed it, adapted it, built upon it. They continued to use cuneiform, They worshipped the Sumerian gods, they maintained the temples and ziggurats. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took the empire to even greater heights. He proclaimed himself a god, commissioning monuments that depicted him with a horned helmet, a symbol of divinity. One famous stele shows Naram-Sin climbing a mountain, trampling his enemies underfoot, while stars representing the gods shine above him. But empires, no matter how mighty, are fragile. Internal rebellions, invasions by foreign tribes, and the strain of maintaining such a large territory eventually led to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Around 2100 BCE, it fell apart. The cities of Sumer regained their independence. For a time there was chaos, as different city-states vied for dominance. But then, a new power emerged from the city of Ur. The third dynasty of Ur, often called Ur III, was a golden age for Mesopotamia. The kings of Ur reunified the region, bringing stability and prosperity. They built new ziggurats, commissioned works of art, and developed an efficient bureaucracy. The most famous of these kings was Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu is known for creating one of the earliest law codes in history. Carved on stone tablets, his laws dealt with issues like theft, assault, and false accusations. Unlike later law codes, which often prescribed harsh physical punishments, Ur-Nammu's laws frequently imposed fines. For example, if a man knocked out another man's tooth, he had to pay a fine in silver. This was a more humane approach, emphasizing restitution over retribution. Ur-Nammu also rebuilt the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive structure that still stands, in ruins, today. This ziggurat was dedicated to the moon god Nana. It had 3 great staircases leading to the top, and its mud brick walls were covered with fired bricks to protect them from the elements. At night the ziggurat would have been lit by torches, visible for miles across the flat plain. A beacon of civilization. The Ur III period was also a time of great literary activity. Scribes copied and preserved ancient texts, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would not be lost. They wrote new hymns and prayers, praising the gods and the kings. One hymn to the goddess Inanna describes her as the Lady of Heaven, the Queen of all the lands. The economy of Ur III was highly organized. The state controlled much of the agricultural production, collecting taxes in the form of grain, livestock, and labor. Workers were organized into groups, overseen by foremen, and assigned tasks such as building canals, maintaining temples, or working in the fields. Records were meticulously kept on clay tablets. Archaeologists have found thousands of these administrative documents, detailing everything from rations given to workers to the number of sheep in a flock. It was a bureaucracy that would make any modern government jealous. But the Ur III state was also rigid. Perhaps too rigid. The heavy taxes and labor demands created resentment, and external threats were growing. Nomadic tribes from the surrounding deserts and mountains were becoming more aggressive. Around 2000 BCE, the city of Ur was attacked and destroyed by the Elamites, a people from the region that is now southwestern Iran. The last king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, was taken captive. The once great city was left in ruins. A Sumerian poet wrote a lamentation for the fall of Ur, mourning the destruction of the city, the scattering of its people, the desecration of its temples. The city has been turned into ruins, the people groan, where is the city, where are the people? And so, the third dynasty of Ur came to an end. But Mesopotamian civilization did not end. It simply transformed. After the fall of Ur, Mesopotamia once again fragmented into competing city-states. But in the north, a small city was beginning to rise in prominence. Babylon. Around 1800 BCE, Babylon was just one of many cities along the Euphrates. But under the leadership of a king named Hammurabi, it would become the most powerful city in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi was a brilliant military leader and a skilled diplomat. He formed alliances, then broke them when it suited him. He conquered rival cities, bringing them under Babylonian control. Within a few decades, he had created an empire that stretched across much of Mesopotamia. But Hammurabi is best known, not for his conquests, but for his law code. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most famous legal documents in history. It consists of 282 laws, carved on a black stone stele nearly 8 feet tall. At the top of the stele is an image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The laws cover a wide range of topics: property rights, trade, family relations, wages, and criminal offenses. Some of the laws are based on the principle of an eye for an eye, literal retribution. If a man caused another man to lose an eye, his own eye would be put out. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be put to death. But other laws were more nuanced. If a merchant cheated a customer, he had to repay 6 times the amount. If a surgeon successfully performed a difficult operation, he was entitled to a fee. But if the patient died, the surgeon's hand might be cut off. These laws were not always fair by modern standards. Punishments varied depending on social class. A nobleman received harsher penalties than a commoner, but he also had more rights. Slaves had almost no legal protections. Yet the Code of Hammurabi represented an important step forward. It established that laws should be written down, publicly displayed, and applied consistently. Justice should not be arbitrary. Even the king was, in theory, subject to the law. Babylon, under Hammurabi, became a magnificent city. The city walls were thick and high, protecting the population. Inside there were grand palaces, temples, and bustling markets. The Ishtar Gate, built later by King Nebuchadnezzar II, was a marvel of engineering and art. It was decorated with glazed blue bricks, depicting lions, bulls, and dragons. Walking through the Ishtar Gate must have been an awe-inspiring experience. The deep blue of the tiles, the golden animals, the sheer scale of the structure. It was a statement of power and prestige. Babylon was also a center of learning. Scribes and scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. They made detailed observations of the night sky, tracking the movements of planets. They developed sophisticated astronomical tables, predicting eclipses and planetary positions. Babylonian mathematicians used algebra to solve complex problems. They calculated square roots, worked with fractions, and understood the concept of zero long before it was known in Europe. In medicine, Babylonian physicians diagnosed illnesses, prescribed treatments, and performed surgeries. They believed that diseases could be caused by demons or the displeasure of the gods. So treatment often involved both practical remedies, like herbal medicines, and spiritual interventions, like prayers and rituals. One medical text describes treatments for headaches, stomach ailments, and wounds. It lists ingredients like honey, beer, and various plants. Modern analysis has shown that some of these remedies actually had medicinal properties. Daily life in Babylon was vibrant. In the morning, the markets would fill with people. Farmers brought their produce. Merchants displayed goods from distant lands. Spices from India, timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia. Babylon was a hub of trade, connecting the civilizations of the ancient world. In the residential quarters, families lived in multi-story houses built around courtyards. The wealthier families had homes with several rooms, decorated with wall paintings and furnished with wooden furniture. The poor lived in smaller, simpler dwellings. But everyone, rich or poor, shared a common culture. They worshipped the same gods, celebrated the same festivals, told the same stories. One of the most important festivals was the New Year celebration, called Akitu. It lasted for 12 days and involved elaborate rituals. The statue of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, was paraded through the streets. The king participated in ceremonies that symbolically reenacted the creation of the world. There were feasts, music, dancing, and offerings to the gods. It was a time of renewal, a time to ensure the favor of the gods for the coming year. Religion permeated every aspect of Babylonian life. Temples were not just places of worship, but also economic centers. They owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands of people, and controlled significant wealth. The priests were powerful figures, intermediaries between the human and divine realms. People would go to the temples to offer sacrifices, seek blessings, or consult the gods about important decisions. Divination was common. Priests would examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, looking for signs. They would interpret dreams, study the flight of birds, or observe unusual natural phenomena, all in an attempt to understand the will of the gods. One divination text reads, "If the liver of the sheep has a certain mark, the king will be victorious in battle." These practices may seem strange to us, but they were a way for the Babylonians to feel some control over an unpredictable world. As the centuries passed, Babylon's fortunes rose and fell. After Hammurabi's death, the empire gradually declined. New powers emerged, including the Hittites, the Kassites, and the Assyrians. But Babylon would rise again, reaching its greatest glory in the 6th century BCE under King Nebuchadnezzar II. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us turn our attention to the north, to a people known for their military prowess and ruthlessness: the Assyrians. The Assyrians were a people who lived in the northern part of Mesopotamia, centered around the city of Ashur. For much of their history, they were overshadowed by the more powerful southern states like Babylon. But around 1400 BCE, Assyria began to expand. And by the 8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire was the dominant power in the Near East. The Assyrians were feared for their military might. They developed new technologies and tactics that made them nearly unbeatable. Iron weapons, siege engines, cavalry units. The Assyrian army was a well-oiled machine. They conquered vast territories, from Egypt to Persia, from Anatolia to the Arabian desert. But the Assyrians were also known for their brutality. They practiced psychological warfare, using terror to subdue their enemies. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed. The inhabitants were killed, enslaved, or deported to distant parts of the empire. The Assyrians left detailed records of their conquests, often boasting of the devastation they inflicted. One inscription reads, "I filled the streets with corpses. I flayed the nobles and covered the walls of the city with their skins." These accounts were meant to intimidate, to discourage rebellion. And they worked. Many cities surrendered without a fight, preferring to pay tribute rather than face the wrath of the Assyrian army. But the Assyrians were not simply barbarians. They were also great builders and patrons of culture. The Assyrian kings constructed magnificent palaces, adorned with intricate reliefs and colossal statues. The palace of King Sargon II at Dur-Sharrukin covered over 200 acres and included a ziggurat, temples, and administrative buildings. The walls were lined with stone reliefs depicting the king's victories, hunting scenes, and religious ceremonies. One famous relief shows King Ashurbanipal hunting lions. The king, in his chariot, draws his bow. Lions leap toward him, but his arrows find their marks. It is a powerful image of royal strength and courage. The Assyrians also created one of the first great libraries in history. King Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the 7th century BCE, was a scholar as well as a warrior. He collected texts from across the empire, bringing them to his capital at Nineveh. The library of Ashurbanipal contained over 30,000 clay tablets. Literary works, scientific texts, historical records, religious hymns. It was a repository of knowledge. Among the treasures of the library was a complete copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was this copy that archaeologists discovered in the 19th century, bringing the ancient story back to life. Despite their power, the Assyrians were not invincible. The constant military campaigns drained resources. The subject peoples chafed under Assyrian rule. And eventually, the empire's enemies united against it. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes attacked Nineveh. The city fell after a brutal siege. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed so mighty, collapsed in just a few years. The once great cities were burned, their palaces looted, their libraries scattered. An ancient prophecy had proclaimed, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." And so it was. Now, let us step away from the grand narratives of kings and empires. Let us look at how ordinary people lived in ancient Mesopotamia. For most people, life was centered around the family and the farm. Agriculture was the foundation of the economy. Farmers grew barley, wheat, dates, onions, lentils, and other crops. They raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. The work was hard from sunrise to sunset. In the spring, the fields had to be plowed and planted. In the summer, the crops had to be watered, weeds pulled. In the autumn, the harvest began. Entire families worked together, cutting the grain with sickles, bundling it into sheaves, carrying it to the threshing floor. The grain was threshed to separate the kernels from the chaff, then winnowed to remove the lighter chaff, leaving the heavy grain behind. This grain was stored in large jars or granaries, to be used throughout the year. Women played a vital role in daily life. They managed the household, prepared food, made clothing, and raised the children. Women ground grain into flour, a laborious process that could take hours each day. They baked bread, brewed beer, and cooked stews. They spun wool into thread, wove thread into fabric, and sewed garments. In wealthier families, women might oversee servants who did much of this work. But in poorer families, the women did everything themselves. Children were expected to help from a young age. Boys worked in the fields with their fathers, learning to plow, sow, and harvest. Girls helped their mothers with cooking, cleaning, and caring for younger siblings. Education was available, but mostly for boys from wealthy families. They learned to read and write, to calculate, to understand religious texts. For the vast majority, education was informal, passed down from parent to child. Marriage was an important social institution. Marriages were often arranged by families, with the goal of forming alliances or consolidating wealth. A bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family. In return, the bride brought a dowry into the marriage. Weddings were occasions for celebration. There would be feasting, music, and dancing. The couple would move into the groom's family home, or if they could afford it, establish their own household. Women retained some legal rights. They could own property, run businesses, and initiate divorce under certain circumstances. But overall, society was patriarchal. Men held most of the power and authority. Religion was deeply woven into daily life. People made offerings to the gods regularly, seeking their favor. Small household shrines held images or symbols of family gods. Incense was burned, prayers were recited, libations were poured. Major life events, birth, marriage, death, were marked by religious rituals. When someone died, they were buried with grave goods, items they might need in the afterlife. Jewelry, pottery, weapons, food, even small clay figurines of servants. The Mesopotamians believed in an afterlife, though it was not a particularly pleasant one. The underworld, called Kur or Urkala, was a dark, gloomy place. The dead were thought to exist as shadows eating dust and clay. There was no concept of heaven or hell, no reward or punishment based on moral behavior. Everyone, regardless of how they lived, ended up in the same dreary place. This belief influenced how people approached life. Since the afterlife offered little hope, it was important to make the most of the present. To build, to create, to leave a legacy. Entertainment and leisure were important too. People played board games, one of which, called the Royal Game of has been found in archaeological sites. It involved moving pieces along a board based on the roll of dice. Music and storytelling were popular. Evenings might be spent listening to a bard recite epic tales, or singing songs accompanied by a lyre. Festivals and holidays punctuated the year. These were times of communal celebration. Processions, sacrifices, feasts, games, and performances. They reinforced social bonds and reaffirmed religious beliefs. Medicine and health were concerns for everyone. Illness was often attributed to supernatural causes, but practical treatments were also used. Healers used herbs, poultices, and surgeries. They set broken bones, treated wounds, and even performed trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in labor, and infant mortality was high. Prayers and amulets were used to protect mothers and newborns. The goddess Nintu was invoked as a protector of childbirth. Trade and commerce brought goods from far and wide into Mesopotamian cities. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman. Merchants traveled long distances, forming networks that connected distant lands. Caravans of donkeys carried goods across deserts and mountains. Ships sailed down the rivers and into the Persian Gulf. This trade brought wealth but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. Mesopotamia was never isolated. It was a crossroads, a melting pot. People of different backgrounds lived side by side, learned from each other, and sometimes clashed. As the sun sets over the land between the rivers, we see the lights of countless hearths flickering in the gathering darkness. Families are settling in for the night. Children are being tucked into bed. Stories are being told, and tomorrow, life will begin again. The cycle of planting and harvest. The rituals of worship. The work of building and creating. This is the essence of Mesopotamian civilization. Not just the grand cities and mighty kings, but the everyday lives of ordinary people. As our journey through ancient Mesopotamia draws to a close, it is worth reflecting on the legacy of this remarkable civilization. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization, and with good reason. So many of the things we take for granted today began here. Writing. Without writing, there can be no history, no accumulation of knowledge across generations. The Sumerians gave us cuneiform, and from it, all subsequent writing systems are descended. The alphabet you are reading now has its distant roots in Mesopotamia, cities. Uruk or Babylon, these were the first true cities, places where thousands of people lived together, cooperated, and created something greater than the sum of their parts. Law. The idea that society should be governed by written laws, applied fairly and consistently, began with Hammurabi and his predecessors. This is the foundation of justice, mathematics, and astronomy. The base 60 system, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, our modern calendar, all influenced by Mesopotamian scholars. Literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning, still resonates today. It is one of humanity's first great works of art. Agriculture and technology. The plow, the wheel, irrigation innovations that allowed human societies to grow and thrive. Religion and mythology. The stories of Mesopotamian gods and heroes influenced later cultures. The biblical story of Noah's Ark echoes the Mesopotamian flood myth found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The concept of a 7-day week, the idea of a law-giving god, these have roots in Mesopotamia. But perhaps most importantly, Mesopotamia showed that human beings are capable of extraordinary things. From small farming villages, they built great cities. From scratches in clay, they developed complex writing systems. From observations of the night sky, they created sophisticated astronomical models. They organized societies, created art, told stories, and pondered the great questions of existence. And they did all of this thousands of years ago, without the tools and technologies we have today. They used their ingenuity, their labor, their creativity. They worked together, generation after generation, building on what came before. The cities of Mesopotamia are long gone, buried under the sands of Iraq. But their legacy lives on. Every time you check the time, you are using the base 60 system of the Sumerians. Every time you follow a law, you are part of a tradition that began with Hammurabi. Every time you read a story, you are engaging with a practice that started in the scribble schools of Uruk. Mesopotamia reminds us that civilization is fragile. Empires rise and fall. Cities are built and destroyed. But the ideas, the knowledge, the stories, these endure. They are passed down, adapted, transformed, but never truly lost. And so, as we leave the land between the rivers, we carry with us the wisdom of the ancients. The understanding that we are part of a long story, one that began in Mesopotamia and continues today. And so, our journey through ancient Mesopotamia comes to a close. We have walked the streets of Uruk, climbed the ziggurats of Ur, stood in the shadow of Babylon's greatness. We have witnessed the birth of writing, the creation of law, the rise and fall of empires. We have met farmers and scribes, kings and priests, warriors and poets. These people, living thousands of years ago, were not so different from us. They loved, they worked, they told stories to their children. They dreamed of glory, of immortality, of simply surviving another harvest. And though their cities have long since crumbled into dust, their legacy remains. In every word we write, every law we follow, every story we tell. Rest now, and let these ancient voices carry you gently into sleep. Let the whispers of history soothe you. Good night.